The diagram is a medium for extending the meaning and the significance of architectural design. This is not a book concerning images and a kind of diagrammatic production of images, but on the contrary, it's really the attempt to reveal that the diagrams today has a very great potential to become a kind of medium for analyzing complexity. As also Andrea already said, I'm a philosopher. For me, it was a really interesting experiment to have the opportunity to reflect on the diagram, but at the same time to conceive a manual, which is of course also a very special format. It's not a kind of theoretical book, but it's a kind of collection of different practices, of different chapters, of different diagrammatic practices, trying to also develop a kind of argumentation. The core of this publication is the exhibition Experimental Diagramming that I created together with Anna Huger and Sarah Gretsch, and I think they are also in our room today. The main goal of this exhibition was really to reflect on the contemporary function of diagramming, because of course we were aware that the diagram in architecture and in the history of architecture is a very important phase of radical experimentation at the end of the 20th century, in the 80s and 90s. But we made also the experience as philosophers, but also as teachers, that we experienced always, for example, in design studios, this word as a kind of daily term of the architectural design. So we made the experience that the diagram in our time is a kind of daily term of the design practice. We have we approach also this problem in design, and for me it was really interesting to put questions, to also ask architects what they are really meaning with the diagram, also knowing on the one side the kind of philosophical reflection on diagrams, but on the other side also researching in the field of the diagrammatic design. And for this reason, we tried to, also through the exhibition, to thematize the question of experimental diagrams today. And we wrote a kind of call for practices. And the call for artifacts was a kind of really framework to reflect together also with a group of researchers who are really active in the realm of design-based and design-driven research on the possibility of developing a contemporary discourse on diagramming. And this core experiment was the leading experiment of this book. And this argumentation, I would say, has also a philosophical structure and also a theoretical attempt to really argument and reflect on diagrammatic practices. And for me, and also my philosophical approach, is really important to make this distinction between a conventional practice and an experimental one. After a kind of introduction in which I also introduced the notion of the diagram, and I thematize a kind of sedimentation of this concept starting from the 80s until now, and trying really to explain why I think that it's really important to reflect of a new kind of media criticism, open up the possibility of diagrammatic practices, not just use the diagram as a kind of daily term. And there is a second part, behaviors. This is a long essay by Caterina Padova-Schioppa. And the interesting question of this essay is to thematize the possibility to use the diagram as a theoretical concept and also as a kind of reflexive concept to reread the history of the architectural diagram in architecture. And Caterina particularly focused on the Italian drawing tradition and made, I think, a very interesting also archive work, revealing some unknown practices maybe that could be also defined as diagrams, even if in that time in which they were produced, they, of course, were not defined as such. And Caterina also in this chapter discovers practices, for example, by Purini, or for example, Cesare Leonardi, trying to reread the architectural Italian drawing in a diagrammatic way. In the third chapter, I address some strategies. And for me, I think that the work for this chapter is, in a sense, invisible. And maybe it's the most invisible part of this book, because the work for this chapter consisted in really talking with architects, trying to write emails to, if you want, the old generation of the 80s and 90s, trying really to ask new statements concerning the development of this medium in architecture. And it was really interesting also to analyze reactions, to analyze also different forms of interpretation of the diagram, also as a kind of epoch, which was really important in that time, but it's maybe not contemporary anymore. And but it was also very interesting to work with architectural offices and trying to analyze together the different uses that these offices develop concerning diagrammatic practices, as for example, in the case of Zarapolo, and also the work, for example, of Kraft. I had a different, for example, a meeting also with Thomas Willemide of Kraft, really trying to discuss the diagrammatic practices, in a sense also reflecting on all practices of this office and trying to reveal the diagram as a generative medium, not just as a kind of representational tool. And I think it was interesting, for example, also to investigate through the voice of Benjamin Moira the work of Yuna Shigami as maybe a kind of diagrammatic framework to understand also his work as a kind of post-Anthropocene practice. In the chapter Reasonings, Anna Ugard also developed, I think, an interesting approach to the diagram through also the link between a theoretical reflection and a design-driven practice. And Anna Ugard, I think, showed a very important expertise in linking these two different practices. On the one side, the theory, and on the other side, the design, and trying to reveal the way these two different forms of reflexivities could also generate a very particular way of dealing with diagrammatic practices. In the fifth chapter, we are dealing with experiments. I think that in this chapter, we are stressing the aesthetic also capacities of diagrammatic practices. And this chapter is also something that is, in a sense, moving between art and architecture with many, many different experiments. And for this reason, I also confronted the different contributors with language, really asked also to write short texts and trying to define the diagram. So trying also to link the diagram as an image with the critical potential of the reflection on diagrammatic practices. And in the last chapter, it was for me really important to address some contemporary features, really in contacting also a group of researchers that I think are really also experimenting on the theoretical level with the diagrams, and really trying to motivating them to write short essays and short texts on diagrammatic practices. And this chapter addresses also features, also concepts, trying to reveal some, if you want, some movements in the contemporary discourse, and trying to outline keywords in the diagrammatic field. And just one sentence at the end, because of course this kind of journey through the book and through the manual also gave me also the opportunity to reflect on the diagrammatic practices today. And I would say there are, of course, many aspects, and I think we will also address some aspects in the discussion today. at the end of the 20th century, the diagram also was really developed for a medium of a kind of generative form finding, not just as a medium for example, analyzing the complexity, or for example, also to communicate, but really to generate a new form of architecture. And maybe there is, of course, also the problem of this kind of development of form finding, and we can discuss maybe later. So why also, for example, the diagram that has this kind of experimental development or experimental phase then generated also this kind of conventional use of the term after this time, because I think it's also a very important question. But for me, this was a very essential phase for introducing this idea of an experimental practice that generate new forms, and these forms also aimed to overcome all typology and whole typologies and whole forms. So the idea that forms in this sense is also a way to find a diagrammatic process. The possibility also to construct, for example, knowledge through the diagram, and through the diagram as a kind of hybrid sensible scheme, is a very important tool. It's not just a kind of artistic image that we can describe as diagram, but it's also an architectural diagram because we are reflecting on the constructed essence of this image. And the second aspect for this, also for this introduction of the diagram, also as a term and as an experimental practice, was to try also to extend what I call the semantic realm of architecture, trying really to introduce through the diagrams also other dimensions that were not really part of the architectural design, as for example, the movement, the embodied experience, when I think, for example, also of some reflections of Toomey concerning the city and concerning the movement in the city. And I think that today we also are experiencing a kind of shift. So the main goal is not, for example, in the book, the form or the generation of form, as for example, the form of an architectural building, but much more to generate a form of a construction. And this construction is, first of all, a kind of semantic construction of architecture. So something that is really addressing the way architecture refers, for example, to reality, to territory, to landscape, to a domestic or interior space, and not just to find a form.
But there is not that much of literature on this topic, isn't it? How could you build up a kind of a theoretical, let's say, literature? Was it easy making that? Did you kind of draw upon previous atlases, or was it kind of a work that you had to do from scratch?
I think it's not easy. I think the attempt of this research was also to link the philosophical discourse with the architectural one. And there are two different also forms of literature and also of researchers. Because, for example, in Germany, there is a strong research on diagrammatic practices, for example, in the work of Sibylle Kremer, and also in the media philosophy. And on the other side, there is, of course, also the French reflection on diagrammatic practices, and for example, and also, of course, the very important reference to Deleuze. And I try also to reread Deleuze also from my background. So my background is German classical philosophy, is in also the Kantian schematism, also the idea that we need also media in order to express also reflection thinking, and also to really approach perception. And I try to link different framework, and also in this book to reactualize one aspect of the philosophy of Deleuze that I think it's already important to outline, that is the idea that the diagram is really a kind of possibility of fact and not the fact itself. And I think it's a very important critical perspective to reactualize this idea, to really criticize also the reduction of the construction of images to images as such. And also to maybe criticize or to be careful with this idea that images are generating also affects, emotions, perception, and also an aesthetic knowledge in architecture, but really trying to reveal also the constructed essence of these images. And I think that is, for example, a very important topic in the digital development of the diagram. Maybe I think that is one reason why also the diagram became maybe a kind of daily term, also through this kind of digital possibility to manipulate form and to generate form. And I think at this point it's also important to reflect on the diagrammatic structure of digital images. And for this reason, I think that Deleuze is already, and the philosophy of Deleuze is important also for the contemporary development of architecture. And Deleuze gave an answer also to the generation of the end of the 20th century that also quote massively also Deleuze, because Deleuze was really careful with the distinction between the diagram and the image. And I think that is something that we have to reactualize, and it is an essential part of the definition of the diagram as an experimental practice. So a diagram as an experimental diagram is not just a kind of aesthetic image, but it is the diagram that is also able to reflect on the way it's generated. And also, of course, on the implication of this generation. And for this critical text, I tried to build a kind of framework also of different references that I think in this book are in a sense also a little bit implicit, because we are dealing also with a kind of manual that works through images also. Why an image is a diagram, and I think it's also very important aspects of this, for example, of this exhibition. We have many different media. So we had video, we had leporellos, we had a game board. If you, for example, go to the practice of, for example, Marc Garcia or Peter Bertram. If you want, I can also give you the, you are on side, page 180, then you can see that also game boards are part of the diagrammatic tools, and Leporello, but also, for example, virtual reality. So we have, I would say, many different media, and we define, and also the contributors, of course, define these practices as diagrams. And I think in this sense, the diagram is also something that tries to reveal the critical power, not of the media, but also of the way these media are constructed, and also, if you want, they are trying to explain why these media are really diagrams in the form of reasonings and also argumentations. And for this reason, I think that we need to reflect on the possibility of experimenting with diagrams, not just for generating forms, that is for me very, very important, but to reflect on the possibility of really embedding other dimensions into the architecture. And I think this is a very important contemporary question. For example, in the Anthropocene or in the new text of ecology, we will be confronted also in the future with these problems, not just to address these topics, but to embed these topics into the architectural design. And for this reason, we need also to reflect and to extend the possibility and the capacity of this media. Otherwise, we will work as maybe philosophers. But I think that the problem is to embed also theoretical question tags, and not just theoretical, but really the real questions into the architecture. And in this sense, I motivate, in this case, the contributors, but in my case, for example, students, to use the diagrams as a medium of translation of reality into the architecture.
I would like to invite Giovanni Corbellini, if he could say something on either on this book and the difference that he sees kind of taking place between 10 years ago and now. What happened to the diagram as he could really follow this trend going on and developing?
My generation, it is the generation that was proposing itself in the 90s. And in the 90s was the moment in which diagrams were probably the real instrument, the real tool that architects used in order to, let's say, state a position. And I mean, also this, there were already a sort of generational statement against the diagram. In this, that same issue of Lotus, there is an article by Piero Vittorio Aureli and Gabriele Mastrilli, which is against the diagram. Something that simplifies and is something that goes against architectural autonomy. And this is precisely the functioning, the working, and the potential of the diagram. So something which is a sort of narrative machines, a narrative machine that connects different issues and make them working within the project. Of course, this narrative can be very simplified, like in the so-called one-liners, which were very fashionable in the 90s and the first 2000, in the early 2000. But I mean, this is something that that worked very well as an instrument of communication after the project, within the project, as an instrument to understand the potential of the project. And I still think this is a very powerful tool and something that, I mean, it is true that students are not so keen to use it, but because they lack narrative instrument, they pretend or they wish to approach architecture as a very linear process in which they extrude the plans, the elevation, and all the drawings in a linear way, while the diagram is something that always connects the reasons of the project in various parts, various scales. It is something which has a sort of formative influence, but it is not formal. It is something more narrative. So that's the very, let's say, messy thinking that I came up with in this time. And the attempt was to try to understand how this generation is still using the diagram right now. And there are many instances of different understanding and use of this instrument by that generation. They are wildly different, let's say.
And Giorgio is asking, how do you define what is a diagram and what is not a diagram? The boundaries risk being either too narrow or too broad. Can you say that something is a diagram because of what it does rather than how it looks like? I would like to elaborate a bit more on this question to say that about, let's say, I was one of the authors together with Maria Fedorchenko, and we questioned ourselves in the same way. Our problem was to define what is the difference between a diagram and a plan, which is not obvious. And we say, our hypothesis was that perhaps there is a kind of in between the two things, which is the so-called decorated diagram, which is nothing else than a diagram which is extruded, as actually Giovanni was saying.
Yes, I would say that it's a very important question, no? Really to avoid also a very broad definition of the diagram. I think the philosophical also definition that the diagram is a sensible scheme, and it is also a kind of hybrid scheme between the image and the visual practice and the language and the information. I think that is a very basic definition, but it also works, for example, in the book, in which the diagram is this kind of construction, in which the image is also confronted with the content. And that is something that we also could define as the relationality of the diagram, because the diagram is also establishing relationships between different elements and between elements also, for example, of visual practice. And maybe also the example now of Andrea is also fitting what I'm saying, because the image could be also being just the, I don't know, not the plan, but this kind of fullness of the perception, just perceiving also the visual medium as such. The diagram is trying to really grasp the hybrid nature of these different constructions, in which, for example, in these diagrams, we are not just perceiving images, but we are perceiving a very specific form of construction. And for this reason, maybe the most difficult question of the book was to really integrate the language and to give also the language a kind of diagrammatic role. I would not say that the language in this book is just a description, just something that is also part of a book that has to, if you want, have also some words and some text. No, I would say the language is also this attempt to introduce a critical reflection of the image, and it's also kind of integral part of the diagrammatic practices. Maybe it's strange or sounds also strange, but it was also my way to question the boundary in between the diagram and the image. And of course, in a very classical, if you want, conventional way, in the diagram, you have also a kind of legend, you have a kind of description in many cases, for example, also in scientific, or for example, in diagrams that you are using in economics, you have very often a kind of legend in order to explain what you are showing. And in the architecture, through also the focus on forms, maybe we lost also this kind of critical power of language concerning the diagram, even if also the generation of the end of the 20th century was really active in writing and in reflecting also on diagrammatic power. And I think that is something that we should also reactualize, even if maybe this generation is giving not so much importance to this written practice. I don't know. And in the book, I also trying to find some, if you want, some concepts or main aspects to define the diagrams today, because my attempt was not just to reactualize the recent history of the diagrams, but also analyze the development of the contemporary diagram. And some points that I think are really important to define today the diagram concerns the relationality, the multimediality, so the idea that the diagram is also present in different media practices. This idea of the information as something that is really a kind of build also a kind of hybrid structure between language and visual practice. The multiscalarity, I think it's something that is really present now also in the use of diagrammatic practices that really trying to cross different scales and to work also on different scales and to link scales. And the last part is, or the last point is the extension of effects. And so really to thematize also the effects and the possible implications of the diagrams in a critical way. And I think that these different aspects are maybe, I would say, some aspects that are for me an integral part of the experimental diagramming.
No, I have a follow-up question from mine before, because if I understood correctly, while driving, Lidia was saying that the diagram should be understood in parallel with language in a way. Instead, I was thinking of it as an alternative in a way to language, and especially linking this to the kind of generational issue Corbellini was making reference to. I was seeing the diagram in the 90s and also maybe more in the late 90s and the early 2000s as a kind of alternative project to the kind of verbosity of criticality that occupied field of architecture during the late 70s and 80s. So linking the diagram to a kind of what's the so-called projective stance on architecture, rather than the language one.
But many thanks also for this reflection. But the interesting thing, I think, is for me also as philosopher, was to also discover that the language played so an important role also for this generation. Even if, of course, we maybe are approaching much more the forms and the architecture that they develop or they still develop. But the interesting thing was also how they are trying to reflect on the diagram and embed to this kind of reflection also specific realms, for example, of perception into the architecture. For example, trying to criticize some boundaries between landscape and the city and the urban space and the architecture. And for me, it was really, and I think it's still also kind of open question to understand how to integrate and embed this architectural reflection into the architecture also of producing forms or of be, if you want, engaged with forms. But it's maybe something that they receive in a sense as philosophers, reading this history of the diagram in architecture. And many thanks. So, for example, one idea was to give also researchers the opportunity, for example, to really write a definition of concerning the diagram, and also in the experimental chapters in which we are really stressing the diagrams, and we are in a sense producing also maybe strong also artistic practice, or we of course in a sense reach also the boundaries between architecture and art to motivate it, maybe also to provoke researchers to write texts on the diagrammatic practices, describing, of course, the practice, but also trying to work with language. Maybe also with a kind of poetic language, it's not just to describe, it's not just a catalog also of practices, but trying to reflect on the different boundaries they are exploring, and also explaining that they are referring to other dimensions that maybe also they think they are not so part of the architectural production. And that is, I think, is also a very important value of the diagram. Through the diagram, also researchers thematize aspects that are not part of the architectural production. And it is something that is, of course, something that is happening in the language or in the critical reflection. But the interesting thing is to reflect on the way they are trying to embed through the practice these dimensions. Klaus.
When you say, Lidia, language, what kind of dimension of the language are we here addressing? Is it language in order to name something on the level of a word, for example, naming an object and transferring this into a more or less abstract symbol? Or is language understood as a thing what creates relations among these entities then? And there we are then in the realm not of naming, but in the realm of creating narratives. So I wonder in which kind of dimension of language are we here operating?
Yeah, I think there are there are several uses of languages, and I think it's interesting also to read the manual from this perspective, also considering also the different layers of languages, and then discuss also together on the different dimensions that we are addressing, because there are really different dimensions. There is, of course, a theoretical one trying to define, I think also maybe my path, trying to reflect on the diagram on a philosophical level, and also trying to define, for example, the contemporary uses of diagram. There is also the language of the architectural theory and also of the architectural history. There is also, for example, but there are also different languages of architectural theory, because, for example, also the two different chapters, the chapter I wrote and the chapter that, for example, Caterina Padoa-Schioppa wrote, are also very different in the language, and also in the way, for example, Caterina is using the theoretical language to really perceive architectural images as diagrams, and also explaining and find really to use this kind of new archive of the diagrams. And this is also a very different language from, for example, the language of Anna Uger, which is also a language that is argumenting, but is also argumenting through the drawings and through the language. And then we have many different linguistic practice or language-based practice. For example, for the exhibition, we have the definition, and we have also definition that really trying to define the diagram, and much more definition than trying to define the horizon of the diagram as a medium, or really changing the boundaries. And then we have the features, and for the features, the language is also a descriptive one, but also a theoretical one, trying to open up the trajectories of the diagrammatic practices today. So there are really many different languages. And I think it's also an interesting aspect of this book. So trying to reveal the richness also of the architectural languages. And the language is very often an architectural one. There is, of course, the abstract language of philosophers or of the theory, but there is also the language of architects who are writing, and who are writing also thinking in a spatial way. And I think maybe it could be a very interesting also experiment to read the book without the images and just with a description. I think that also Anna, that is also my answer, but I think Anna Huger also with her work trying also to reveal a kind of definition of the diagram as a practice of reasoning, and also showing that the diagram, both from the theoretical side and also on the design side, has really the potential to develop a very specific way of reasonings in architecture, dealing also with practices that I think Anna developed in a experimental way, not just adapting practices, but trying to also reveal an experimental character of diagrammatic practices, for example.
Yeah. Thank you, Lydia. I'm still here. The diagram was a tool for reasoning, you can say, in my PhD, because it helped. It was a concept that could kind of link a drawing practice with a writing practice, and it could link, let's say, intuition or sketching with structuring ideas and thoughts, and it could also kind of link a digital way of drawing with an analog way of drawing. So there was in all these, there was a diagrammatic level kind of, that was the basic idea behind the thesis, that there would always be a diagrammatic level, no matter how our media practices would change, to say it like very short. That was how that idea of the diagram became very central and very helpful for the thesis.
But maybe, Klaus, you could also say something concerning your feature, because I think that in your feature concerning differentiating, of course, we are also using the language. And I think that also for me, the importance of the book was also really to address effects and contemporary effects. So not just to say we use diagrams to generate, of course, images in architecture, but also to generate new possibility of architectures to act.
Yeah. Yeah, if I would now look at this kind of feature, what deals with the practice of forensics, also from the perspective of language, and this kind of binary, what I made up before between a sort of, a language, a relational language, which tries to do a narrative, or a language or language in the sense that it depicts a certain object and starts to represent it. I think here in this sense, the diagram plays much more role in creating relations among very different things, media forms, such as audio files, I don't know, also photographs, time stamps, etc. And where there the diagram has this really relational function, and understood in this sense as a sort of the diagram in a forensic practice as this transition from first not necessarily related different fragments, also very small fragments, and using the diagram as a moment in relating these fragments together, and from this stems actually the spatial figuration of an event and the temporal figuration of an event. So this a little bit how I would sort of see in this language as a very relational, I don't know, relational element. And the language of the diagrams of forensic architecture are really, I think, about, yes, relating very different things together and providing a structure for narrative. Yeah.
And that, I think this is also a crucial topic of the diagram today, but in general, and also of the book, really to reflect on this rationality. And I think it's also a way to address some multimedia practices as diagrams to reflect on this relationality and on the effects of this relationality.